think it's time. Sure. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, hello. Right, so here we are for our acoustics research seminar. This week, the topic is cave acoustics. And I thought of this very exciting title: Were Paleolithic cave paintings placed because of acoustics? So that's what we're going to be talking about. So around 40,000 years ago, there seems to, our ancestors started this activity of painting in the caves, things that, I will call material culture or motifs. But basically, all over Europe, if you go into these caves, you'll find things like dots or lines or animals which have actually been painted on the rock or actually carved on the rock. Or yes, come on in. So around 40,000 years ago, there's this kind of activity that started, we believe, in our ancestors, where they were, let's call it, decorating caves. And this activity went on to about 15,000 years ago, by which time it stopped. So we don't find any evidence of that after that time. But within those 25,000 years, there's a whole load of this material culture that has been left in the caves. And of course, we as humans, we want to know why did they do these things. So the first thing is, do we know who created these? I'm going to call it art, and perhaps at points I'll also call them motifs and paintings, and I'll use those terms. So who created them? Well, we know they were anatomically modern humans, so they would think and feel just in the same way as you do and I do. We know that they were hunter-gatherers, and I'm hoping you all know what that means. So basically, this was pre-agricultural revolution, where people kind of lived in bands and went around looking for food and tended to move around depending on where food was available. They were not what people might think cave dwellers, in the sense that they don't live inside the caves, at least not where these paintings are found. So there's some evidence that they might live in the entrance of the caves or just outside, but not well within the caves. And there's a number of problems with that. Mainly, you'd struggle to get some good lighting to actually live in these places which are totally dark. So they might live in the entrance of caves, but not right inside the caves where we find these paintings. All of these paintings, or most of these paintings, are in very difficult to access positions. You actually have to walk sometimes, 20-25 minutes into a cave, go up and over rocks and under crevices and so on to find where the paintings are. So there was quite a good deal of exploration going on. And we need to think about these people as people who were adventurous, who would kind of venture inside these caves, risking their lives, risking not finding their way back in order to either see or produce these images. And some of the images are so beautiful, so well painted, much better than what I can do, that we can probably think of these people as artists, although we cannot be sure whether what they were doing was actually art as an expressive way. So I'm going to just play a little excerpt of a podcast I've just listened to last week. And this little bit kind of explains more or less the position of archaeologists towards these paintings, and kind of also touches upon acoustics, which is quite interesting. But what I want you to do is basically listen to how this eminent archaeologist, this guy is a leader, he's discovered a number of paintings in the Chauvet cave, in the Neo cave, and he's talking about the different aspects of this art. So let's just have a listen to that for a bit. It never works.
Do you can see two lines which are converging, two black lines, okay? And once when I was standing about here, and somebody was finding the line as Yannick is doing it now, I thought, oh my God, it's an ibex, because you see in front of those two lines, you've got like the head of an ibex, but and the head and the breast, but which is made with natural cracks on the wall. So somebody came here, so those natural cracks in the wall, thought it was an ibex head, and just drew the horns.
Wow.
You see, so we thought I had told you before about the use of the natural relief.
The direction of the light is very important.
Yes, because the direction of the light makes the surface of the wall come alive. Because you see all the reliefs, the cracks, and the wall then is really alive. And for those people, that was very important because they used it. This is not a hypothesis because they use it. They used it.
When you say the wall is alive, for those people,
yeah,
you're not meaning a metaphor. You mean really alive.
Yes. I mean, for them, there were spirits, gods, whatever, inside the walls, and they were appearing in places. They didn't do it for fun. And to come here, you had to be fully equipped, to have light, to have charcoal, to make the drawings, etc. And you see, you don't have paintings all over the place. There are quite a few, but they might have done many more if they had wanted to. So I think they didn't come here that often to paint.
So what happened here all those many years
ago?
ago?
There must have been ceremonies. This was a very sacred place because you've got that accumulation of paintings. They might not have been done all at the same time, but still. And it was the most sacred place inside the cave. That's why they put all those paintings. It's probably in relation with the acoustics. It's the only place in the cave with such acoustics. See, here, you hear it. The acoustics is special.
Clap your hand just once. I want to hear how much echo there is.
So it is special. And all this all around us is full of paintings.
So the idea is that I'm sorry to make you listen through, 3 minutes of that, but the ideas there are quite important because this is what I've been hearing from the people in the field. Things like the rock comes alive. It must be because they were having rituals in here, that, they were worshipping the gods. They looked at the animals coming out of the cave walls, etc., etc., which in archaeology seems to be, a good sort of avenue to take. But there's scarce evidence to actually say that, did they believe in gods? We don't know. This is prehistory. This is what they left. This is, what we know about them. And there's nothing there written about gods. These were mainly animals. There's very little depictions of landscapes or anything else. And, I, for a start, could start saying, well, why would they go into the caves to see animals coming alive out of the rock? Obviously there's a lot of discussion to be had about that, but I don't really like the idea of jumping into these conclusions. And in the same way, when you kind of start going, it must be because of the acoustics. Well, yes, there is some kind of interesting response in there, but is there a direct correlation? Is there a direct indication that they were doing it because of the acoustics? And that's really what this talk is about. Now, one other thing that was mentioned in there was the interviewer at some point said, can you clap once so I can hear the echo? And of course, what we heard then was not echo, but reverberation. And that's a really important aspect in this field because a lot of the archaeologists and musicologists are talking about acoustic terms in a slightly different way to those that we use in acoustic science. So they call echo to reverberation, and they sometimes call resonance to reverberation. But sometimes resonance is actually a resonance, a low frequency boom. So we need to kind of deal with that as well. And of course, sometimes they call echo to the repeating of a sound coming off a wall. So it's kind of quite a tricky thing to look at. But I think the main thing really is this question, if this worked, is this question, why did they paint? Maybe we can't answer that question, right? And perhaps that's not for me as an acoustic scientist to try and answer that question, because I don't have that background. But I can probably try and answer the question of whether the paintings are associated with the acoustics. And that's what I'm going to try to do. So, this work started off in about the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, by these two guys, Yegor Reznikov and Michel Dauvois, and they visited these caves in France, which have got these beautiful murals of, bison and lions. These are animals that didn't actually exist in Europe in those days. So you kind of have these really interesting questions, anthropological and historical questions, but again, I'm not here to respond to that. And what Reznikov and Dauvois did or said in their publications was that there seems to be a relationship between the paintings and signs and the sounds that might have been produced adjacent to them. So a kind of an association, a correlation between this artistic activity and the sound, the acoustics near the paintings. And they kind of posed a number of research questions. For instance, are there more paintings or signs in locations with the best resonance or sound quality? And we don't know what resonance means there. It could be resonance, it could be reverberation. Is there a link between the location of a painting or a sign and the sound value of this location in the cave? And I think sound value here is perhaps a better description, because it kind of tells us, there was something interesting about the acoustics, and we all know what that is. We all know that if we go into a church, we start coughing and dropping things because we like the reverberation, and if we go into Manchester Library, we do the same because we like the echo. So we recognize those things. We recognize those effects. And in their findings, they reported that most pictures are located in or in the immediate vicinity to resonant places, and that the location for a rock painting was chosen to a large extent because of its sound value. Now, those are interesting assertions, and the method they used was basically to go into these caves with sound level meters, singing, using their voice to try and identify where particularly interesting places might be. Reznikov is a musicologist and actually a very good singer, so he was able to cover quite a wide range of frequencies and produce sustained notes and so on. But you can probably see the problems in that methodology in terms of repeatability, for instance, in terms of bias. And even identifying what was the immediate vicinity seemed to be a bit vague. So they, at some point they were commenting on using voice and hearing as a sonar system, and then trying to find in the dark interesting acoustic locations. And then when they found those, they would switch on the torches and see what was around. And they often reported that there was at least a dot, like a very early type of symbol in the vicinity. But that vicinity was a radius of 2 meters. So it's kind of, you walk around in these huge spaces, sometimes you go into little niches, and then you come back into big galleries, and you're using your voice. Then you find, there's a resonance here, or an echo, or a reverberation. Switch on the light, and you go, ooh, there's a motif in there. Okay, so this place is actually resonant, and they realized that and they painted in there. So it's kind of a tricky methodology there. But Reznikov went on to say, well, a meaningful connection between man-made signs and the resonance of a cave can, in my view, be established only on a statistical basis. Only such a systematic study is reliable. If among signs and pictures some are found to correspond to resonant locations, then we can assert this relationship as shown if the positive connections are statistically significant. Otherwise, doubt remains. Perhaps the connection appears just by coincidence. And that's where this project came in. So we were kind of doing this work. The first time I visited these caves was in 2012. We eventually got some funding to go back again with proper equipment. The first time we did some measurements, but it was really difficult to measure in that kind of environment. And obviously we didn't have the right equipment. We went there with dodecahedrons and laptops and things that needed connected to mains. They were big. Sometimes they wouldn't even fit into the spaces that we had to crawl through. So we didn't manage to get proper systematic measurements. So later on, we got some funding, and we went to visit these 5 caves, which are in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, in the north of Spain, in Cantabria and Asturias. And these 5 caves, they're part of the UNESCO protected site of the Altamira cave, and they all have this kind of evidence, which the archaeologists believe relates back to the same cultures that were doing the paintings in the French caves. Now we went there. There was people who knew about, or thought they knew about, acoustics. That is myself. There were musicologists, archaeologists, musical archaeologists. There were experts in the caves themselves that could tell us where things were and what dating they had and so on. And we went in there to try and do a systematic study, as Reznikov called for. This work has actually been very recently published in JASA in September. So obviously in that paper there's a lot more detail, but a lot less pictures than the ones I'm showing you here. So the first thing we kind of got faced with was, how do we take measurements in a space like a cave? I mean, this is not your typical cave that you find on the side of a beach that you can just walk up the sand and you start going into the cave. This is caves where you have to go down massive chutes, you know, tethered, sometimes down a ladder, sometimes just grabbing yourself to the wall. You're carrying equipment, and even though this is portable equipment, you're taking quite a fair bit of equipment. So you're carrying, you know, heavy stuff that you have to pass around. So there's a kind of a big challenge in actually measuring within these spaces. Also, the other problem is you've got no access to mains. In most of these places, you've got no access to mains. In some caves, we actually managed to get like 50, 70 meters of mains cable down from the entrance all the way down. We left the generator at the entrance, which is so far away that you can't hear the noise it makes. But in others, you're walking, you know, say 500 meters into the cave, and it's impossible to get any mains in there. So you need to use battery-operated equipment. Some sites we visited are still in the study. So this site, La Garma, we actually went in and we had to walk within these white dots that were laid down on the floor, because every single red mark is the position of some archaeology that they're still studying. And in this case, you can't see it because there's too much light. But there's a skeleton there. There's another skeleton there, another skeleton there, all decomposing. These are actually medieval burials, that happened in those caves. Okay, so they're much later in time, but this is the kind of environment that you're having to deal with. So, you know, every time you walk around, there might be charcoal deposits from their lanterns or some other evidence like a piece of bone or whatever. So it's really, really tricky to try and go into places like this. So how did we solve that first problem? Well, the first time we went in, you can probably see it here, we took sound field microphones. There's some lights. These are cold lights, LED lights, because people were filming as well. But you can see there's our big yellow dodie. I don't know if this one is still alive. It's probably still there to go to a museum at some point. But, you know, this dodie, which is about this big, would only fit in some of the caves that we visited. In other caves, even though inside they're massive, they've got these huge galleries, you know, bigger than a cathedral, the entrance is this little hole that you have to crawl through. And the dodie just would not fit. We tried in every single kind of, you know, position, the dodie would just not go in. So for the second expedition, we came across this B&O loudspeaker, which our guys in the S3A know very well. It looks like a loaf of bread about this big. The good thing is that it's battery operated and it lasts for about, I don't know, 8 hours, ours did. And also it has quite a wide directivity. That means that the sound is sort of radiated in all directions more or less equally. So we benchmarked the speaker in our anechoic room, so we measured the radiation all around in both the vertical and the horizontal position to try and get close to something that resembles typical acoustic measurements like the ones you get from a Dodi. And we also measured the frequency response, power, and so on. So we used that kind of loudspeaker to generate mainly sine sweeps, and then we picked up those signals using a kind of a studio-type microphone with XLR connections and so on, but the capsule, the actual diaphragm, was a B&K diaphragm, which has, you know, better signal-to-noise ratio. It's flatter and has omnidirectional response, but the actual microphone itself was a lot more robust to plug into, you know, normal equipment. And then we captured that signal either using a digital recorder, which was battery operated, or in places where we could actually take in a laptop, we just captured the signal through a sound card and then into the laptop. And we basically did the sine sweep type of measurements, which you can, you know, post-process and obtain the impulse responses. So we were basically looking for the impulse responses of these spaces. Now, as we go into a cave, we then have to decide where are we going to take our measurements. And of course, because we were being helped by the archaeologists, we knew more or less where to find some of these motifs. So some plans for the caves actually have, you know, very nice detailed presentation of where you'll find these motifs. Others, you basically rely on the archaeologist knowing where they are. And, you know, it was very common to kind of, you know, stand in some place and go, this looks like a really nice control position. A control position is one where you measure the acoustics, but you're not close to any motif. So you might be further than 2 meters from a motif. And you need those because if you're going to do a statistical analysis, you're obviously going to have to compare with and without kind of conditions. And so many times we'd find ourselves kind of deciding, this looks like a really nice place to, you know, to carry out a measurement. There's a flat piece of rock here. It could have been painted, but there's no paintings. And then one of the archaeologists would come and say, oh, no. Yes, there is. There is a dot there. Or there you see a carving on the wall. So there was always, you know, some material culture nearby, and you'd struggle to find these control positions. Of course, in the end, we did find them, but you'd have to be very careful and, of course, work with the other expertise so that you're not making, you know, gross mistakes. Everything was documented, so all the measurements had information about, you know, what was there, if there was anything there, how many dots, what colors, what type of animal, how many animals, what was the distance of that position to the entrance, what was the age, etc., etc. Some of these things were actually kind of completed later on out of the archaeology of the caves, but we kind of ended up with a big spreadsheet, a big matrix of information about every single measurement point. So we measured many more than 177 positions, but some of them, you know, they're fails, so you kind of go and look at the impulse response and you couldn't actually acquire the impulse response correctly, and you only know that when you're back in the lab. So out of all the measurements, which were something like 220, 225, we had 177 useful measurements, accurate measurements. And within those, 98 of them were close to paintings, engravings, etc., the things I'm calling motifs. And within those, 64 of them corresponded to what archaeologists believe are the earlier activity, which is represented by dots and lines. So things like this, where you see lots of dots or some lines, sometimes it's just, you know, a single 2 dots on the wall like that. They're believed to have been done much earlier than these other types of motifs where you've got animals. Okay, this hand stencils, which I tried to do there, they're kind of in between. So they are classified as the earlier types of motifs, but they're slightly later than the dots and lines and earlier than these other periods. Now, having just heard that podcast, it looks like they, in the French caves, they found some of these very well proportioned animals painted almost 32,000 years ago, which kind of starts, making this idea that there's some earlier motifs and late motifs, perhaps a little bit, lopsided. And that's archaeology for you. You keep on finding out. So what classifies these motifs? Well, when I'm doing the statistical analysis, if a certain measurement is close to a particular motif, then I classify that as a positive finding. But I needed to kind of specify more carefully what that means. And for us, what that means is that within a meter, or the measurement is always 1 meter away from the motif. Sometimes it might be closer, not much closer, but it's within a meter, never further than a meter away. And we found that that was correct, because if you want to say that there's some particular effect to this motif, then probably the acoustic effect is quite close to it, rather than 2 meters away, say over here. Okay, so some effects like resonances change quite a lot as you walk around in the space because of the modal distribution of the space, especially if it's a small space. So we needed to kind of classify them in that way. So what kind of motifs you find? Well, here's an example. This one was quite interesting. It's just a rock. It's right at the end of a really long, large cave. And the cave is mainly one main gallery, one main avenue, which is quite wide, let's say about 25, 30 meters wide, but quite long, and you just walk alongside it. And then off to the side, you've got little niches here and there. Of course, the archaeologists were telling us where they were. And right at the end of that cave, you find this rock, which has this painting, which seems to be, it's almost like a road, 2 lines in a sort of curved shape, and then some dots to the side here and there, right? And what the archaeologists say is that this is possibly a map, and that the dots represent some of the niches on the side, which might have paintings or which might have some other characteristic. Again, it's not for me to say, but it's an interesting motif. The most common motifs, of course, are these kinds. So you've got animals, very well represented. In these caves, we didn't find art which was as beautiful as the one in the French caves, the pictures I showed you earlier. But still, even just these kind of profiles of animals are really striking. And when you think that this was done, say, 30,000 years ago, it's quite amazing. Some of them, they're a challenge to the imagination. I really don't know what to think of that. The archaeologists do have an idea for what that is, and I'm not going to tell you. Okay, but then you find some other interesting things. Of course, without light, you can't see that very well. Let me just try this once. So there, okay, maybe you can see it a bit better. There, what you've got is a stalactite, which has been placed sort of horizontal into a little kind of opening of a rock. Right? Now they know, because they've dated the stalactite, that this is, ancient. This is prehistoric, about, at least 15,000 years old. It's when you look at it from a different direction, again, you can't see it very well because it's a bit dark. There's a bit of color, some kind of lines on the top there. But what you can see if you look at it from this angle is that this is a fish. Some of you might actually be able to see it here. Okay? It's very much like a fish, and someone has just placed an object on the mouth of that fish, so that when you look at it from the right angle, you just go, oh, of course, that's a fish. And that's what Jean-Claude was kind of talking about when he was describing that they were using the natural shapes of the rocks or the lines on the rock to actually create these drawings. Let me see. Yeah, lights back on. So you found a lot of this kind of art as well. In some cases, it was you shine a light on a piece of rock, and then on the wall, you see this big bull with the horns coming out. And when you go there, they've actually completed some of the lines. So it's with the shading of the light from the right angle through the rock onto that wall that you actually get the full picture, which is quite ingenious. And it sort of reveals this really high level of thought that, you know, I, for one, didn't quite think existed in those days. But of course it does. They were very artistical. Okay, so let's move on to acoustics, because so far we've only been talking about archaeology mainly. So what did we do? Out of all the impulse responses, we extracted everything we could. So it was basically everything in the kitchen sink. We tried to take T13 octave bands, and also as an average, like you get in the ISO 3382 type of averages, early decay time, also across octave bands and as an average, C80 for clarity, D50 for definition, STI for speech intelligibility. We took two metrics which report on the perception of echoes. So basically you get this metric, and if it's above a certain threshold, there's some evidence that a human would perceive an echo in that response. It's used obviously in modern acoustics. We also applied a whole load of low frequency merit factors that I had used in my PhD, which basically describe the low frequency response of spaces. They were derived for modern rooms, for control rooms, but basically if you've got a result which is close to 1, then you know that that space doesn't have any evidence of resonances, and as that result drops, then you have more evidence that there might be a resonant mode in there that is perceptible. So these were also kind of calibrated against perception thresholds. So we had a whole load of these metrics, basically 23 acoustic metrics. You can see them on the spreadsheet here according to every single one of the measurements. And then further on, you've got all the archaeological information, whether there's a motif or not, what its type is, color, so on. So interesting is to start looking at what sort of responses do we find in these spaces, okay? And so here you've got all of the different sections that we've measured within the caves. And what I have done is I've basically grouped the measurements that were taken within each of the sections, right? So if we were walking along an avenue and then there was a little entrance and you find a small kind of niche to the side, you take 3 or 4 measurements there, you group them all up, and you end up with a section here. Okay, so that's what these sections are. And you can see that you've got the medians and the variance of that data. And I think, you know, the most important kind of results that we see here is that most of the reverberation in these spaces is not very large. So we're kind of between 0.5 to 1.5. And I'll give you some points for comparison. So for instance, Royal Opera House has got a reverberation time of about 1.1 second, which is very similar to many of the places we visited. Some places had reverberation which was even shorter than your average bedroom or living room. But more striking, we didn't find any spaces that had huge reverberation times like what you find in churches, or what most people associate with caves. So when you talk about caves, and you heard Jean-Claude also clapping in one of those caves, actually that sounds much more reverberant than any of the spaces we visited. So the kind of the ecosystem that we're visiting here is actually much more represented by smaller, shorter reverberation times than what most people expect from caves. And that's interesting, and it's actually, it's found in the results as well, as you'll see later. Early decay time, the only reason why I'm presenting it here is because we know that early decay time is much more close to our perception of reverberation. So a lot of the studies were looking at early decay time, because if they were using reverberation somehow to guide themselves, then probably, you know, they were looking at the early decay time. They weren't looking at the early decay time, but what we think they might be hearing is better represented by early decay time. Also, early decay time is a lot more sensitive to early reflections, and those might be an important aspect when you're close to a motif and listening to some kind of effect. So we needed to consider that. In terms of clarity, I'll put the preferred range for modern rooms, so concert halls and so on. You want to have a clarity between -2 and above. And what we can see is that all of these spaces had excellent clarity. Were they designed? Probably not. Some people sometimes argue they are. Same thing for definition. It's a different kind of measure of how, the acoustic response arrives at the measurement position and how it compares to the direct sound. So here you can see that again, most of the places we visited had what we could qualify in our modern day as good definition. And the same thing happens with speech intelligibility. Okay, so speech intelligibility above 0.5 is considered good. If you're designing a lecture room, then you want at least to get 0.5 STI. Well, all of these spaces achieve that, which is quite interesting. You wouldn't expect that from a cave. But that's what these caves had in terms of response. Okay, but we had to deal with a whole load of these acoustic metrics, and that was complicated. So we could do analysis of correlation between reverberation time and position of paintings, or EDT and position of paintings, or C80 and position of paintings. And you see what I mean. Do we want to look at 125 hertz, then 250? It was really difficult to kind of do simple correlations with the metrics directly. So one of the things that we did, which is quite common when you're doing studies with lots of variables, is to try and look for dimensions within the data. So we've got all of this acoustic data, and we know that some of those variables, some of those metrics, are actually correlated. They basically report on the same thing. Just imagine RT at 500 and RT at 1000 are probably very highly correlated. And RT is inversely correlated to clarity, C80 or D50. So there's kind of redundancy in the data. So we wanted to look at the underlying dimensions. What we did was we applied a principal component analysis, and then we started trying to interpret the dimensions that came out. We got 3 significant dimensions. This is just from the acoustic data, okay? So there's no archaeology in there. It could be from halls all around the world. And what we found is that there is one dimension which explains 72% of the data, and it seems to relate to the amount of energy decay, or how quickly the energy decays. You can see that all of the reverberation time metrics are on this side of that dimension, and all of the definition, clarity, speech intelligibility are on this side. Okay, so short reverberation times and high intelligibility, and long reverberation times and low intelligibility. The second dimension, which was also significant, explains 11% of the variance in the data. And we can see that most correlated to that dimension are the metrics for low frequency response. So we sort of assumed, we interpreted that dimension as a dimension that reports on the merit of the low frequency response. And if you've got high values, remember these were merit factors, which achieve 1 when you get really good responses without resonances. So high values report good rooms, or spaces without resonances, and low values report spaces which have evidence of resonances. We had a third dimension which reported 4% of the variance in the data, and that was on echoes. Now I'm not even going to show that because the further analysis looking at this variable didn't reveal any significant evidence. There was no statistical significance ever from detection of echoes. And that really is what we felt. We didn't find any spaces inside these caves which had clear echoes, places where you would clap and get a really clear reflection off a wall. None of that. And the reasons for that, of course, are because you've got these very rugged kind of walls, some of them porous, some of them quite hard, but none of them was kind of flat enough and far away enough for you to get a nice clear echo coming back. Okay, now perhaps a little bit more interesting is when you start separating your data into places which have got a motif against places which have got no motifs, and you look at them in relation to these significant dimensions. And here what you can see is that the paintings which are the black dots, they tend to be more concentrated towards the center of this dimension, dimension number 1, than the paintings without, which, you know, some of them tend to lie away in the extremities. Now that was an interesting finding. You can actually see that in terms of reverberation time ranges, you can see that the range of places where you find motifs is shorter and more in the middle than the range where you find all of the other control values. And we also see that we seem to have motifs more concentrated towards the low values of dimension 2. So most of the black dots are kind of down on this axis in relation to the red dots, which represent no motifs. So we seem to have these interesting variables here that are showing some kind of difference between finding a motif or not. And you can see these are the 90% confidence intervals and the central values for each of those two categories. And you can see that there is no overlap in any of the dimensions. So the data is kind of statistically well separated to suggest that there might be a significant difference in both of these dimensions. Now, one of the things I want to do is I want to try and get you to try and tell me which of these sound samples that I'm going to show you correspond to places where you might have a motif against those which might not. So, pay attention. Oh, by the way, I'll tell you what this is before we go on. These are impulse responses convolved with an input signal which was recorded anechoically. The first one is by a student that did a project on this last year or 2 years ago. It's his singing. Again, it doesn't work. Maybe a bit louder. Okay, so what you're trying to do is you're trying to tell me if this corresponds to a place with a motif or not. So that was number 1. Number 2. Number 3. And number 4. So who thinks number 1 corresponds to a place with a motif? I can see some people already giving up. No one. Number 2? Number 1 is a motif. So you're not a sufficient sample of the population. Just 1. Number 2. Who thinks number 2 is next to a painting? No one. Number 3? Ooh, okay. Wow. And number 4? Okay. So, no, don't go there. Just go to the next slide. So, for each of those samples, what I have done is I've plotted dimension 2, which reports on the existence of resonances, okay? And I have just allowed each of these samples to stay in their correct positions. Now, on this side, you've got the earlier type of motifs, which supposedly are associated with resonances. And on this side, you've got control positions, no motifs next to them. And they're placed in their kind of correct position in terms of dimension 2. So this is a high value of dimension 2, and you can see that there's not a lot of very striking resonances on the response. That's a waterfall plot, so it's time versus frequency. And down here, you've got a situation where you've got quite a lot of what we would call noticeable resonances, okay? And that's, of course, low on dimension 2, which reports on the merit of low-frequency response. So most of you said, yeah, this one is close to a motif. So you've identified that one quite correctly. But no one identified this one, which is also close to a motif. Or you did, Ellie, right at the last minute. But also, in the control examples, you've got one example here which appears to have evidence of resonances, but it's got no motif next to it. So really by listening, and of course I know this isn't the right place to try and do this, perhaps in the cave it would have been better, but we find evidence of places with no motifs with resonances, evidence of places with motifs with resonances, evidence of places with motifs without resonances, and so on. So we need a much better way of actually extracting this data and come out with some conclusion that is scientifically plausible, or at least scientifically supported. So what we tried to do then was we tried to fit these statistical models, and we tried to find whether there's statistical evidence to say that a particular motif, a particular type of motif, is associated with a particular acoustic dimension. So in here, because we're trying to detect whether there's a motif or not, so it's a binary choice, 0 or 1, the typical model is a logistic model. That's what you see there. And what we can put into the model are the variables that we want to look at. So each of these x1, x2, x3, and x4 are the variables that we extracted from our acoustic results. So x1 was dimension 1, the one that reports on reverberation. x2 is the one that reports on modal response. X3 is the one that reports on echoes. And then I've also put a transformation of dimension 1, which is its square values, because you remember I started by saying that it seems that motifs are in the center of that dimension, which means that you've got this kind of quadratic distribution. There's more evidence of results in the center than in the periphery. And you can model that with the square of the variable. So we did our first analysis, which was to try and predict the earlier types of motifs, the dots and lines, from the acoustic response. So that's all that this does, is it tells you what is the probability of me finding a motif at this point with these acoustic metrics. Okay, so you get an acoustic response and you say, am I likely to find a motif here? And in this case, we're looking at, am I likely to find a dot or a line? You can then look at what variables are significant in trying to explain that. So the first thing is we got a significant model that seems to explain about 18% of the data. Okay? Now that's quite low for those of you who haven't dealt with this, but it's interesting because it's a significant model. It means that the logistic model can model the data from the acoustic response. Only x1 and x2, which are dimensions 1 and 2 of the acoustic metrics, are actually significant. And what we can see if we look at odds ratios as, effect sizes from here, is that dots and lines are more likely in positions where you find low reverberation times. It's about 1.5 times more likely when you're lower on that dimension 1 to find a dot or a line. And this is an interesting result because it kind of corroborates what Reznikov was saying, that dots and lines are more likely in responses with modal sound fields. So if there are evidence of resonances, then you're more likely to actually find a dot or a line nearby. Notice that these odds ratios, 2 times, 1.5 times, they're all very low. Okay, you'd expect something above 3.5 times to have a medium effect, and I think over 20 times to have a large effect. So these are low effect sizes, but they're statistically significant, so they're interesting. One other thing that I should tell you is that this result contradicts what most people are saying about the acoustics. This is saying that you're more likely to find motifs in low reverberant spaces, and what most people are saying is that it's when you've got lots of resonance or reverberance that you find the places all painted. So that one contradicts, the one on the bottom actually reinforces. We then kind of looked at the data and said, okay, what if we use this model? But now we don't want to care whether it's a dot or a line or a lion or an ibex. We just want to try and predict the position of paintings, any types of paintings, from the acoustic response. And in this other model, we actually get a slightly better explanation of the variance. So the model is slightly better at fitting the data. So it goes up to 23%, but now we've got different significant variables. So some variables have lost their significance, like RT is no longer significant in predicting the position of any motif. But resonances, that number 2, is a significant variable. Echoes, again, just before is not significant, and you'll see that echoes are never significant. And now the square of the first variable becomes significant. Now, what that is saying is, again, you're more likely to find motifs when you've got a resonant response. That's what this significant variable is telling us. And you're 1.7 times more likely to find a motif if you've got more evidence of resonance. And then you've got this other really interesting result, which says that you're more likely to find motifs if that variable decreases. Now, that variable decreasing means that you're going into the central values of dimension 1. We had already seen that in the data, and this is just corroborating that. But it's telling us that it applies when you look at all types of motifs together rather than just dots or lines, which is an interesting new result. But then obviously these are all, again, quite low odd ratios, 1.5, 1.7, 2 times, so these are low effect sizes. So as a scientist, you kind of start thinking, what else can explain this, this result? Is there other things that I could bring into this model that somehow explain the data better? So you're trying to build a better model, basically. So one of the other bits of data that I had was the distance of any of the measurement positions to the entrance, right? And I added that to the model and reran the analysis. And again, we've got a significant model. And in this case, the variance explained of the model goes up to 30. This is our best model so far. So we can explain 30% of the variance in the acoustic data, of the variance in the location of motifs from the acoustic data. And obviously we can see that distance to the entrance has become a significant variable. We also see that apart from echoes, all of the other variables are not significant. So dimension 1, dimension 2, the square of dimension 1, and distance to the entrance are all important. The effect sizes are still small. They're bound between 1 and about 2. So again, same trend, very small effect sizes. But one of the really interesting results from here is that just by adding something which has nothing to do with acoustics bumps up the fitness of the model by quite a lot, by 10%, okay? Which is a third of what we had before, or more than a third, yeah? So there seems to be other things at play that explain where these motifs might be placed. Now, obviously, you probably want to hear some of these things with something better than just someone singing a very low pitch. So this is someone singing in the anechoic room, not ours, but recorded in another anechoic room. If it worked. I don't know where the sound has gone. So that's in one of the positions in the caves. One which is a lot more reverberant. This one has got no motifs next to it. It's a control. This one is next to some dots. And I can hear reverberation there, but I can't really hear a difference between them. So the question that Alex was saying is the answer yes or no? Well, there is some statistical evidence, although it is weak. And we have very low effect sizes, okay? So we find that paintings are twice as likely in positions with moderate reverberation and in more resonant responses. So these results are kind of both supporting and contradicting previous findings, okay? People were saying it's where you've got lots of reverberation. We're saying no, it's where you've got moderate reverberation. And people were saying it's where you get resonant responses, and we're kind of supporting that. Now, why would we have such low effect sizes? First of all, we could have completely wrong acoustic metrics. We're using modern metrics. Maybe something different would relate more to how people were listening in the past. I don't really believe that, but that is a possibility. But what we know is that it is very likely that there are other factors which are much more significantly associated. We saw that just distance to the entrance becomes such an important variable in the model. So, what could be happening? Well, we have this question. With stats, we find a correlation, but we don't find a causation. So we can't go out there and shout, oh yeah, there's evidence that they were definitely painting by by acoustics. Well, we found a statistical correlation, but what might that mean? Well, we already know that. That's the correlation that paintings are more likely to be found in places with resonance and with moderate reverberation. This kind of space sounds to me like a small space. A small room would have moderate reverberation and it would have resonances. So what might that tell us in terms of the story we're trying to find? If we've got probability of finding a motif goes up with a given acoustic variable, we've talked about resonance or moderate RT. In that case, we're kind of, 1 over. Well, that's what the stats are telling us in terms of correlation. But we could very quickly substitute that variable and say, well, actually, what happens is that you find the motifs in smaller niches. And in that case, then your correlation is between the probability of finding a motif and 1 over the room volume. If you could measure the room volume, maybe you find a better model. And of course, we probably wouldn't think that they were painting because of the size of the room, but that would be a possible correlation. Another correlation is, okay, discard that, and let's think that they were just looking for somewhere safe. A place where you can see all the walls except the entrance. So I, with my torch, can see all of these walls and I go, this is a nice place to paint. I know I'm protected. I can hear that I'm protected because, there's not a lot of reverberation, so this could be a nice place. Now, I'm merely speculating here, but that would explain this correlation. Another one would be that they were trying to find these really inaccessible places, which typically are smaller niches off to the side that you have to go under crevices, through chutes, and so on. And typically, they are of a small room volume, which would then correspond to having resonances or moderate reverberation times. So the idea here is that we found a correlation statistically between the position of the motifs and the acoustic response, but the explanation, the cause, doesn't necessarily need to fit the idea that they were painting because of acoustic resonances. So in the end, what we can say is that the jury's still out. We still have a story to uncover, but we cannot jump on these results and start saying we've got a major finding and now we know how these guys were behaving, 40,000, 30,000 years ago. That's my opinion. And that's it. Thank you very much. So we're bang on 2 o'clock. If anyone wants to leave or need to leave, then feel free. If you want to ask questions or hang about, have a party. Yes?
I thought the kind of acoustic metrics that you showed.
Just try and keep it quiet because we're recording and... Sorry, go on, James.
I was just surprised at how kind of low the RTs were and the values for parity. Is that typical for sort of caves, or is it just that my reference of a cave is like films where...
Yeah. So there is that problem that most people associate caves with very high RTs, and we have these very low, well, they go from very low to about 2.5 seconds, so some of them are long. But one of the explanations I found is that these spaces, you've got lots of corrugated rocks, many of them are porous, some of them are much more shiny, much harder, but you get a lot of interaction between the sound waves and the surfaces, so you get a lot of losses. So it's really, really quickly you lose all of that energy. And I found other people reporting on the same thing. One of them was Trevor Cox in his book. That's, he reports on caves being not as reverberant as one would expect. So we kind of expect churches and cathedrals to be very reverberant, but they are very cuboid-like and they have very hard surfaces, some of them parallel. In caves, you'll be really struggling to find any kind of parallel walls. So the energy is basically being scattered everywhere. There's many more interactions between the sound wave and the boundary, so you get a lot more absorption. That's not to say that some caves will not have really long reverberation times. So it looks like the ones in France, in the Pyrenees, they seem to have a lot more reverberation. And I only know that because I've heard people, doing like interviews inside them. So it would be really interesting to go there and measure them properly, but I couldn't find any measurements of them. So I would say that the explanation is you've got, a lot more kind of corrugation on the surfaces that absorbs sound or scatters it, and therefore leads to more absorption, more interactions. Yes?
Yeah, I just correlation versus causation. It's like,
Yeah.
Just wouldn't have any thoughts how you can actually ask the question of whether acoustics is the cause of where something
Yeah.
how you might actually take this next step forward.
Yeah. I think that's the problem that exists with the area at the moment, is that people are looking at the other end. They're seeing the evidence and finding an explanation. So they see these lines they drew on the wall and they think, well, they could only be thinking that the animals are coming out of the wall. That's one possibility of many, right? So you're looking from the other end. So an experiment like, let's ask a whole load of people to go into caves and start painting on the walls, would be an interesting one. But you've got a whole load of methodological problems. The biggest of them is that we have a completely different setup, understanding of the world to these people. So, we don't know what the reasons that led them into the caves were. So if you send, say, 20 people inside the cave, if they're all students, they might have different reasons than if they're all pregnant women, for instance. You've got this sort of problem of deciding who is going to go. We don't know if the people that were going into the caves were like special people from the band, artists, or, just young adults that would be really adventurous. We don't know about that. But beyond that, you've got all of the other methodological problems of what sort of light would they take, right? How would they navigate within the cave? Even what they're dressing might mediate the type of art or the actions that they're going to have. So some people have done similar kind of studies, phenomenological studies, where you ask people to sort of go and act in the way that we believe they were acting in some ancient past. And, there's some interesting results from that, but I would say that you'd still not be able to then say, we know exactly why they did this. You wouldn't. You can answer how they did it. You can probably even answer in what we know who they are, but why they did it, unless someone comes back from the past and says, this is why we did it, we wanted to, this was our movie or whatever. But you find loads of explanations. And they're really exciting. That's the thing. You can get very excited about this. The hand stencil. When I first saw, that was the first thing I saw, was a hand stencil. You see it on the wall, with your head torch, and you're kind of thinking, someone drew this or did this. They used to hold pigment in their hands, in their mouth, put the hand on the wall, and then blow over the hand, and that would then make a cloud of pigment with just the stencil of the hand. So I looked at that and thought, that is, someone like me. It's a human hand, and it's almost like they're trying to touch from the past. It's really exciting, and you can start going, it's a message, and it's beautiful. But we have no evidence for that. So as a scientist, I'll leave it at, statistical models, and correlation is not causation. But, yeah. Do you have an idea how we could do it?
That's incredibly difficult. How could you ever?
Very, very. I did ask this from sorry, I'll get to you, Rick. I did ask this from the statistician that helped me out with all of this. And he said that people in economics, they have models that they can throw in that test it, that test the causation aspect. And I didn't understand it, but what he seemed to be saying was that you need to be able to manipulate the model. You need to be able to kind of query the model and say, okay, if I do this, where do you go? We can't query this model because we don't have a proper model. So, we'd need someone from prehistory to tell us.
So the answer is we need it.
Yes. Rick. Yes. So every measurement was up to a meter from the wall and no closer than about 0.5 meters. So the source, so we had lots of problems with that. Where do we place the source? And should the source be close to the motif? Because maybe they were singing and that's where they were exciting the resonances. So we tried a number of those combinations. But in the end, a lot of this was mediated by where we could actually place things. So a microphone, you can actually, put a stand and, crane the neck and put it close to where you want to measure. But the source, you need a sturdier tripod. It stoops on the end of a... So we ended up kind of having, say, if it was a small niche, we'd have one source position somewhere in the middle of that niche. If we had a large space, like a gallery about the same size as this or bigger, then we'd try a number of source positions. I did 2 models, which was interesting. That's reported on the paper. I didn't report it here. So there's models where I basically go, okay, here's a section, and I'm going to suppose that if there's any motif in this section, then I have reason to believe that the acoustics are special. So that's the average sort of approach. And then we had another approach, another coding, which was, here's a motif, so only this measurement, which is close to the motif, relates to an effect. If I measured here with more than one source position, then each of those source positions counts towards the motif is here, which could bias things a little bit. But what I noticed, and this was really interesting, was if I use the individual position models, then resonance is a significant factor as well as reverberation. But if I average them as expected, resonance no longer is a significant factor. Yeah. And that's, it's really interesting. So that's kind of saying, well, if you thought resonance was one of the things they were painting about, well, that gets removed as soon as you average. Yeah. That is really tricky. So we can't put the microphone too close to the source, of course, because you get near field effects. So you kind of have to think about, what kind of, how was this happening? How were they doing it? And I think we ended up doing some experiments, like where we tried to measure very close to the source, but I don't think I ever used those. In many cases, I don't think I could retrieve the impulse response properly from it. Sorry, go on. Yeah. Yes. So the controls were, and again, there might be lots of flaws with this methodology, but they were kind of, have we found a place with no motifs? Eureka, because these places are painted everywhere except close to the entrance. And then we would try and find, there's a kind of a flattish hard rock bit. So it's not porous. They might have painted here if they wanted, right? Of course, if you're in front of a porous piece of rock, then, no one is going to paint there. So you're not going to use that as a control. So we tried to use something which was identical or similar to the places where you had paintings. Far enough away, of course, from many of them. Another question?
Were you looking at the positions where you would have painted?
Yeah. So you're thinking, if someone has done this, and if there's some kind of...
They kind of make sense. You're looking at them where you painted.
Yeah.
Like things like that fish.
Yeah.
Where you've drawn a line from this angle over here.
Yeah. So you're saying, did I then place a microphone somewhere in the middle here that reports that motif? No.
Okay.
I didn't, because that, again, raises huge problems. It kind of asks... if I code this as near a motif, then I might be making the mistake of saying this is actually not a motif. If it was close to the hand, you'd get this acoustic response. Over there, you don't. So you have to kind of decide with what you go. Yeah.
So this is trying to
Yeah.
position. But considering that the amount there way to count some kind of taste by going like
Okay, so the only thing that we did which is any close to that was we tried to fit more complex models than this on things like era. So we tried to see whether the era of each of each group of paintings was associated with a different acoustic response, which kind of would answer that. So, you know, I like niches and resonances, but this other person likes very reverberant spaces. Okay, and I draw dots, and this person draws fishes. And we did an analysis like that, but we didn't find it was significant. So we tried it with era, we tried it with color, and we tried it with type. So you can do dots and lines, you can do hands, and then you can do animals, and then there's a second, I'm going to call it phase, but it's not a phase, but there's a second type of animals where they actually paint the body in a different color. So it's like a filled animal rather than just the contours. And we didn't find that any of those models were significant. Now, we can't say that that wasn't the case, but we can certainly say that the data that we've got doesn't show that that is the case. Which is interesting, because when you look at this data, you know, you kind of come into this as a skeptic and you think, well, you know, it's going to be difficult to find evidence. But even with all the methodological problems, even with all of the issues, we're looking at 25,000 years of activity. I mean, you know, if you think back, what can you report? You can probably report back to the pyramids 3,000 years ago. We're talking, you know, loads, 7 times more, 8 times more than that. And we're grouping all of that and saying, can we now decide whether they were painting by acoustics or not? And the models seem to say, well, there's some correlation. So obviously, the question we need to ask is, what does this correlation mean? Now, have we got a result or not? And unfortunately, it's weak enough for us, you know, we can't go and publish in Nature, for instance. But we need to interpret the results nevertheless. James. Well, that I really hope that was recorded, because that is exactly the question. And in archaeoacoustics, in this field of study, that is the initial supposition straight away. So, you know, there's people that very quickly say, here's a rock, here's an engraving of a hammer, and when I stand on this rock and I clap, I get a clear echo from that facade over there. And here's another example of that, and another example of that, and another example of that. Now, unfortunately, none of those studies quantifies it objectively with proper measurements and then, you know, some sort of analysis. But they all try to say that they did it because there's an echo in there, and then they, you know, they then extrapolate to say, they obviously looked at the rock as, you know, a representation of God. This was the god hammer. And, you know, in other cases, you've got this macaw bird, which was a South American bird. And you see these depictions of that bird everywhere in places where you've got these echoes. And they're saying they're talking about the spirit of the bird and so on, which is great. Okay, it's a good idea, but until you actually put some science behind it, you can't really, you can't really be sure that that was the case. And that's exactly the point. So, it seems like there's a correlation. You might find lots of evidence for that, but if you really want to say that, then go and find other places where there's echoes and there's, no depictions. And I can assure you I'll find loads of them. You go anywhere where there are rocks and you'll find places with echoes. Why are they not painted? They didn't find them. Some of them are much easier to find, So I guess that is the problem. And what I was trying to do with this study, to some extent, it became a bit of a quest to try and see what kind of methodology can we apply to this question and how can we answer it. And in the end, we ended up with these results, which are kind of, it's neither here nor there. But the methodology is probably the only way you could do it. It's kind of go around, get as many examples as you can, with and without, and then do some kind of stats. I don't know of any other way, scientifically. Yes?
I'm no expert on even with human interference.
Yes. And in some cases it was modified, so some of these spaces were modified. We've got one of the caves, I think it's this one we're in. They opened the road because people used to drive there in the 60s to actually look at these things. So they would drive and park their car and then walk up a niche and go, "Oh, look at that," and then get in their car and keep driving. And of course, the big gallery has been modified in that way, and you then try and measure in the niches which you can clearly see haven't been modified. And then you've got this problem of interaction between this space and the larger space. But in most cases, the acoustics, the local acoustics weren't being affected by the general acoustics outside. And if they were, then we'd kind of think, okay, let's find another evidence. So for instance, this can't be used as control. And if it was a painted one, we'd say, have you got other niches with paintings? Because we might not be able to use that. And one big change in all of these caves, I think, was the entrance. So all of these entrances collapsed. Right? So you can't measure close to the entrance. But that wasn't a problem because a lot of the activity was never close to the entrance. There was archaeology close to the entrance, so you'd find bones of animals and spear arrows and, spear points and so on. But you wouldn't find, all of these, magnificent panels and so on. So, of course, the caves have changed, but some of the niches where we measured haven't. Yeah. So I don't know much about that. As far as I remember, it was ochre that they were using. The red paint is ochre. The black one, I think, is charcoal. But I might be wrong here. So there's some pigments that they were used. And I remember at least one location, an archaeologist saying, there was these blobs and these things on the wall, and they were saying, well, we believe that this was like a tryout. They were trying to see whether it worked. But I don't recall loads of those. Certainly, we didn't kept on talking about, oh, no, that was, that's just, they were sharpening their pencil or whatever. No, there were no occasions like that apart from at least once that I remember, which wasn't close to any of the paintings. And that's quite interesting because you kind of go in and you see these finished products without any sort of, sketches or anything like that. Yeah. Which is quite interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and the archaeologists recognized that there are different skills. So some people were a lot more artistic than others, and some of them were, their sense of perspective and size and shape was excellent. So that, there were different levels of skill involved. And what we do know is that there's it's almost like graffiti, there's like a dot, and then someone else comes and puts lots of dots, and then someone else comes and draws a horse, and then someone else draws an ibex on top, and then someone else draws, some other animal, all on top of each other. And it's really difficult to understand why that would be, because, if I want to draw something, if I want to do something on this board, I will wipe the board first so that you can see my whatever it is that I'm doing. But in there, it seems that they were doing it on top of, other people's, if not their own kind of art. And we don't understand why that is. We tried to correlate also to the number of paintings in a certain location, but we didn't have enough specific points to do that, to kind of go, okay, this location has 1, this is 10, this is 20. We did do that, but, the models weren't significant.
Consider connection between sort of spatial, visual features of space. So, because the study was about relation between sonic. There has been loads of studies on sonic features of space and sonic. Of course, there's kind of a way to assess sonic. Does that make a significant? I mean, visual, same sonic, visual art.
Yeah. Well, okay, you're doing something there which is quite tricky and people tend to do, which is to talk about visual artists and sonic artists, which I'm not even sure apply nowadays where we have those concepts. So, you can say, oh, I'm more visual, I'm more sonic, I'm more haptic, and Will has done some tests on that, and he knows that that is not necessarily true and not stable over the course of a life, let alone, a day or whatever. But we have that concept, so we can understand. I can kind of judge my actions and say I'm much more haptic than, visual or whatever. But we need to think that we're talking about people who lived 30,000 years ago, and that concept might not be, meaningful for them. They might just do whatever they do. So it's kind of to start thinking now as they would have thought is a tricky proposition that we should avoid. Okay, even if it is applicable, we should try and avoid that because we don't know. But I think your main question was, is the setting relevant? And I think the setting will be very relevant. Of course, you're not going to paint there if you can't reach it. And what we do know is that they would travel and put themselves in danger to actually paint within this niche. There's a place where they called it the Gallery of the Anthropomorphs, right? And you've got this stalactite coming down. It's a kind of flattish stalactite. And you've got these two anthropomorphs, one on each side. They believe one is the man, the other one is the woman. And the woman seems to be vomiting or shouting or something because there's something coming out of her mouth. She seems to be pregnant as well because she seems to have a belly. And all of this is kind of, about this big. But to get in, there's nothing else there. On that little, well, it's not little, it's a kind of a quarter of this room niche. But to get there, you need to go, in some places they've actually put step ladders so that you can climb over the rock. But they would have climbed over the rock, and then down, then under a little passage, then up again, and so on, to get to that point. There's no other entrance, right? So they were obviously going to places with a purpose, right? In this case, it was there, to paint that. But you also have other aspects, such as if the rock is porous, then the paint is not going to stay. So even if they painted, you don't know it's there. So we might believe that they were choosing shiny surfaces to paint on. And then you've got the problem with the light. So the lighting, you know, do you hold the light in your hand? In which case your view is from here. Do you know the Matisse painting, the dance where they're all holding hands? Big one, it's in Russia. Okay, it's a big painting with people holding hands in a circle dancing. He says that you need to look at that painting. If the painting is there, you need to look at it from here. And that's when you will see the actual thing that he intended, rather than from the front where you can see something. So all of that, of course, must have been, you know, an element, a choice. But again, we don't know. So maybe if we could quantify that and put it in a model, it would explain the, you know, the occurrences much better. Cool. All right. People are falling asleep back there. I'll let you guys go. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming today. Thank you. I'm late for our meeting. Yeah, I can go straight away. Ellie, will you be able to wrap up? So where's did you record this or?
Yeah, I sent David, Trevor, and John a link for them to read.
Okay, cool. And it will be online in our website. Okay. I'm sorry it took me.
That's how it looked. The sound was perfect.
Cool, excellent.
I found out I put the wrong video settings on the encoder, so.
I come up so that we can check that, because if we can get that
I know exactly.
it's great. It rewinds and everything.
Cool. Yeah, excellent.
It was really good.
On your live stream,
he was trying because she was like on his face. But yeah, you shouldn't have said it though. Not to the microphone.
He shouldn't have said it.
Not to the microphone. I saw some people outside, but then I thought, no, we've got this booked for, you know, an extra hour.
Those two chaps were waiting for him.
Oh, okay.
me?
Yeah, but they've been watching it in the library anyway.
Oh, okay.